I have a really sort of boneheaded clip to play for you today from a Republican senator from Florida, Rick Scott. And the clip is interesting, but really it's going to serve as a kind of jumping off point for us to talk about really some of the basics of how the American economy is organized and how it is really based on the type of relationship that we have with China. And so the point of this is for us to better understand why Donald Trump's critique of the US China trade relationship is so wrong and so misguided. And you really can't understand that unless you understand some of what we're going to talk about here. So, as many of you know, you've probably heard Trump say, and it's true, the United States imports a ton of stuff from China. This includes raw materials, this includes finished electronic products and other products. And we don't export as much to China as we import from China, meaning we have a trade deficit with China. The obvious reasons why this is the situation include labor is cheaper in China, the weaker regulatory environment in China also makes it financially advantageous to do this. That's all true, but there's really a lot more to this that we have to understand. So, to set the conversation, here's Florida Senator Rick Scott, he's a Republican, of course, saying nobody in the United States should be buying stuff from communist China. Let's look at what he had to say. I believe this was yesterday or the day before on the floor of the Senate.
Which prohibits the U.S. government from purchasing drones manufactured in countries identified as national security threats like Iran and China. We know Communist China steals their technology and intellectual property, yet the U.S. government continues to buy critical technology like drones with American tax dollars from Chinese companies backed by their government. No one in America should buy products made in Communist China, especially not the U.S. government. We cannot continue this practice, and my American Security Drone Act is a common-sense solution to end this threat to our national security.
So what these Republicans, and to be honest, many Democrats get this wrong as well, what is being missed about the China trade conversation so often is that our trade deficit with China and China holding so much American debt as they do through bonds, this is not a bug in the system. We might not like it, but it's a feature of how the system is designed. And I'll explain to you what that means. Collectively, the United States decided, implicitly, the United States decided decades ago that we value cheap products from China more than we value domestic production. We don't want to pay more for stuff that's made in the United States. When I say we, you might be okay with it, but as a country, in organizing our economy, our leaders have decided we want the cheap stuff from China. So our entire economy is based around specialization, and this includes exporting services like we increasingly do to China, but importing products that have been made in China because the demand for these products is so high, and many of these products would not be affordable to everyday Americans if they were manufactured in the United States. Now, that's because of a whole other set of problems, but if we're going to talk about the US-China trade relationship, we have to sort of set this basic understanding. So naturally, this means we're going to import more stuff from China than we're going to export, and that's where you get a trade deficit. That's the trade deficit Trump refers to and many Republicans refer to. Now, when you hear the word deficit, it sounds bad. It's meant to sound bad because we think, oh, deficit's bad, surplus is good. If you think about your household economy, your household budget, you want to be running a surplus. You want to have something left over at the end of the month rather than to be deficit spending, charging stuff at the end of the month. With the trade relationship, it's not deficit bad, surplus good necessarily. We run a trade deficit by design because of how we've organized the economy to depend on that cheap stuff from China. So everybody in the US can afford more stuff instead of less stuff. And part of what keeps China competitive in this context is that they set the value of their currency relative to the dollar using what's called a modified fixed exchange rate, which basically means if the dollar loses value, China will start buying dollars through bonds. This is how China ends up holding so much of our debt because they want to keep that exchange rate between the dollar and the yuan roughly the same. Now, over the last few years, China has reduced the degree to which they do this. But part of why China is buying so many bonds and holding so much of our debt is because of this trade relationship that we decided we wanted in order to keep the flow of cheap Chinese stuff coming to the United States. Now, I think it's a good moment to mention, you hear the right always go crazy. China owns us. China owns our debt. Japan actually holds more of our debt than China. But for political reasons, you don't really hear much about that. Japan's just not considered a threat in the same way that China is because their economy is a different type of economy. But the point here is we as a country, we as an economy could decide we don't want to import stuff from China anymore. We don't like the political idea of importing stuff from China. We don't like the economic idea. As Rick Scott said, let's stop buying from communist China. We could do that if we wanted. But you have to understand that specialization and trade, including with China, in total have created more jobs in the United States than have been destroyed due to outsourcing. We've given tens of millions of Americans access to products which we now take for granted. So I'm not defending it. What I'm saying is, if we want to have the conversation of no longer having a trade deficit with China, of no longer buying stuff from communist China, as Rick Scott says, we can do that. It would have massive consequences here in the United States. Things would get more expensive. A lot of people would lose jobs, but we might decide that in the long run, it's worth it. But if we're going to have this conversation, we have to have the full conversation, because we have this fantasy conversation where Trump says, get rid of the trade deficit. Rick Scott says, don't buy stuff from communist China. And people end up coming away with this idea that we could just stop buying from China, manufacture domestically, and the economy would be otherwise unaffected other than we've brought jobs home or whatever the case may be. That's not the reality. So I'm not saying what would be right or wrong. What I'm pointing out is we have decades of economic policy built upon the foundation of we value the flow of cheap goods from China more than we value a lot of other things that we could value in the economy. Don't allow Republicans like Rick Scott and Trump, and even some Democrats who don't really understand this, don't let them oversimplify this into stupidity with let's just end the trade deficit type of stuff, because we have decades of implicit and explicit decisions built upon we want to keep the we want to keep the cheap stuff coming from China. Okay, we have an example today. This is not me patting myself on the back, but we have an example today of exactly what I warned you about a couple months ago when I did a story about populism versus social democracy. I did a story called Social Democracy is Being Destroyed by Populism. This was a little while ago. And I warned you about how the rhetoric of populism can sound very good. It can even sound like it's uniting left and right in favor of the middle class or whatever. But that the language can so easily be used to bamboozle and trick people. Trump used populist rhetoric in 2016. Trump tricked many on the right and some on the left with his populist rhetoric in 2016. And we are now seeing the repercussions of that in the current administration. So I have an example for you today from Tucker Carlson, which is exactly what I was warning about. There's more and more left-wingers that are sort of sympathetic to Tucker Carlson, who's a Fox News propagandist, because Tucker has been increasingly using the language of populism, which sometimes sounds reasonable, to hide his horrible policy ideas. Sometimes Tucker, you turn it on, it sounds like a white nationalist show. And then sometimes you turn it on, like last night or the night before, and you hear Tucker using pretty uncontroversial populist language, which could be implemented with right-wing policy, or it could be implemented with left-wing policy. And he did it again this week. And there are people on the right, of course, but there's even leftists just gushing about, look at the common sense that we're hearing here from Tucker Carlson. And it's painful to see people fall for it. I warned you about this in my segment recently. Let's take a look at the clip.
Forget that in the end, the Republican Party exists to serve the interests of normal people, ordinary people. Middle-class families are the core of this country. They are our hope for the future, our only hope. And yet both parties have shamelessly abandoned them. Middle-class families have no national spokesman. They have no lobby in Washington. Republicans pretend to be their champion. You know by now that they are not. Instead of improving the lives of their voters, the party feeds them a steady diet of mindless symbolic victories, partisan junk food designed to make them feel full even as they waste away. Who cares how many Benghazi hearings we have? We're supposed to care. Why should we? How did Peter Strzok's text messages become more important than saving American jobs from foreign nationals who are taking them? It is lunacy. We fall for it every time. And to the extent this show has participated in it, we apologize with deepest sincerity.
So this is classic populist rhetoric that is very similar on the left and right. Federico Finkelstein from the New School is very, very good. He's one of the foremost experts on left versus right-wing populism. And we have looked at so many examples of rhetoric that is populist rhetoric, which sounds like it could be coming from a leftist or from a lunatic right-winger. The party, here Tucker is saying the Republican Party should be serving the middle class. You hear Democrats sometimes use similar rhetoric. We should be primarily serving the middle class. The middle class is the core of the country. Politicians should focus on improving the lives of voters. He even mentions, Tucker does, the silliness of Benghazi hearing after Benghazi hearing and Peter Strzok's texts. And it's true, that was nonsense. Jobs matter more. Like, he's saying things that are true. But he can't even suppress the right-wing xenophobia. He can't hold it back because he says, hey, we need the Republican Party to protect us from foreign nationals who have taken our jobs. And that's the bubbling up of that virulent anti-immigrant Tucker Carlson that we know, who has said immigrants make our country dirtier and poorer. And this is why the rise of populism on the left, at the exclusion of just a solid socially democratic set of ideas, is so dangerous. As I've said before, social democracy is less about rhetoric and it's more about a clear set of policy ideas, including how do we get healthcare for everybody, finance, education, how do we tax people, how do we do policing? There's so much policy in social democracy. When instead you start seeing populist rhetoric, it can come from the left and right, and it can sound pretty damn good with no regard to the policies that are actually being proposed. So to be clear, you can have populist rhetoric and socially democratic policy. Okay, well, I mean, that would be fine. But people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon to some degree and others, they're great at using just the rhetoric to pull people in to what in the end, at the other side of it, at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, is a terrible set of policy ideas. And Tucker couldn't even hide his dog whistle. It's 95% reasonable populist sounding rhetoric with foreign nationals, which basically means, hey, we've got to keep those Mexicans out, right? That's what's the policy prescription at the end of this. So you have to listen much more carefully because it sounds good. We also shouldn't underestimate the effect that Tucker's advertisers abandoning him might be having on his rhetoric. I don't know. That's another story which we've covered. Tucker's having major problems with advertisers because of some of the white nationalist type sounding rants. Maybe this is posturing for those purposes. I don't know. But the point, the idea here is listen to all my populist sounding rhetoric, but my solutions are xenophobia to support the middle class, stop immigrants from coming in, so on and so forth. Someone said to me on Twitter, this is a shadow tactic. It sounds reasonable. You pull them in with the rhetoric, then you drop the seed of populism when you think no one is looking. And then it's, hey, you know what? You'd better vote for Republicans or Black Lives Matter is going to come and take your house, right? That's the bamboozle. That's the bait and switch that happens. In the end, this is a polished way to tell us Mexicans are stealing our jobs, Black Lives Matter is going to take your house, and we need to stop everybody. So don't fall for this stuff. Review that clip that I did about populism and social democracy, because this was there's no better example of this type of ruse that I warned you about 6 weeks ago or whenever I did that story than in this Tucker Carlson segment. Let me know what you think. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. Remember that you can get the entire show in our audio podcast form every single day. You can get it on whatever your favorite podcasting app is, whether it's iTunes or Podcatcher or whatever else, Spotify, etc. Get that daily audio podcast. Let me know what you think about this populism, social democracy ruse on Twitter, where you can find me at dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Georgina Poole and Hugh O'Regan. Georgina and Hugh, thank you so much for your support. And also thank you to Thomas Todd, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Thomas has been a member for almost 5 years. Grab a membership, join up at joinpakman.com. You can use the code 2020NOW, 2020 now, all one word, all lowercase, to save 66% off of the cost of a membership. Okay, Dr. Anthony Fauci and other health officials testified yesterday before the Senate. There were a bunch of hijinks, including Senator Rand Paul getting into an argument with Dr. Fauci. Texas so disliked Dr. Fauci's testimony that last night Lieutenant Governor in Texas, Dan Patrick, went on Fox News and said, we're not going to listen to Dr. Fauci anymore. But if you ask me, I'm listening to Fauci before I'm listening to Dan Patrick from Texas any day. So what did Dr. Fauci tell us? Some of the things he said were obvious. Number one, Dr. Fauci said, we are not really doing that well. We are clearly not in control of the virus. And we could have 100,000 cases a day in the United States if things don't turn around. Here he is saying it.
It is going to be very disturbing. I will guarantee you that, because when you have an outbreak in one part of the country, even though in other parts of the country they're doing well, they are vulnerable. I made that point very clearly last week at a press conference. We can't just focus on those areas that are having the surge. It puts the entire country at risk. We are now having 40,000+ new cases a day. I would not be surprised if we go up to 100,000 a day if this does not turn around. And so I am very concerned.
So this has already gotten so bad in at least 16 states that they've paused or reversed some aspects of the reopening plans. The four hardest hit states recently in terms of cases are Florida, Arizona, Texas, and California. Now, if you look at growth rate of cases rather than absolute numbers, you actually see some other states that are not getting a lot of attention in terms of percentage growth each day. They are climbing. And if the trend doesn't reverse in 15 or so days, you would have a very different set of states that is the worst in the country in terms of new cases. And again, the message is, we could just be at the beginning here. If you look at the total numbers, we cumulatively have seen 2.7 million coronavirus cases in the United States. If the 16 states that are problematic keep increasing their rate of new cases, just even 10% a week, which is, we've seen much faster increases than that, that 2.7 million number in terms of cumulative cases is going to go up dramatically and very, very quickly. You can run the numbers yourselves. If you look at if we get to 15,000 cases a day in Florida, 10,000 a day in Texas and California, if you start seeing that, these numbers are going to add up insanely quickly. But the administration has moved on. I mean, the Trump administration is just done. They are talking about reopening. They're talking about return to greatness. They're talking about jobs and stocks and all of this other stuff. We are having the four worst days that we've had since the beginning in terms of new cases happened in the last 5 days. Understand that. And hilariously or tragically, or I don't even know what to call it at this point, one of Trump's own hotels failed a coronavirus hygiene audit. There's these rules in terms of hotels of how they're supposed to be cleaning, surfaces are supposed to be wiped down, all of these different rules. Trump International in Manhattan was one of the hotels that Inside Edition audited. Now, Inside Edition, it's sort of like pseudo news, but to the extent that they're telling the truth about this, they had a correspondent check into rooms, including at Trump's hotel, print the program's logo, the Inside Edition logo, on the bed sheets and pillowcases and towels using a washable spray. And you can only see that the spray under ultraviolet light. But if the product is washed or wiped down, then it goes away. And then the Inside Edition correspondent would make it look like someone slept in the room. They would leave, check out, check back in, and go back to the same room the following night. So as far as the hotel knows, this is a new customer, a new guest. There should have been a full cleaning done. Trump International reportedly changed the bed sheets, did not change the pillowcase at all, did not wipe down the desk and other surfaces. So clearly the Trump hotels are not the only ones that are failing to meet the hygiene requirements, and things are looking very, very ugly in a lot of these industries, but many states are just full steam ahead. So at this point, if we ask ourselves, like, where is the ray of hope? Where is the possibility? It's really in the medical field and governors. We have to hope that governors will show leadership, although many of them are not. We have to hope that people will take this more seriously than they've been. I mean, it's been months, but still a lot of people aren't taking this seriously. And we are putting a lot of emphasis on the medical science community, that they will develop an effective treatment, something that's better than just, 15% improvement for only the sickest patients, and a vaccine. And we're really waiting on that at this point because our country has failed. Now, I want to remind you, next I'm going to talk about parts of the U.S. that are doing well, but there are countries that have dominated this. I spoke to a friend who lives in Belgium and is currently in France on a vacation with her boyfriend. Things are great there. I mean, on public transit, everybody's wearing masks. Restaurants are open with fewer tables indoors, even outdoors. Life has resumed. Very few cases now. They are doing it, and I'm envious of that. I admit it. Fortunately, here in Massachusetts, things are going well, but we are judged by the worst of our country. We are not allowed to travel to many parts of the world because, as a country, we are failing, and particularly with people able to come in and out of states because that's the Constitution. I'm not denying that. We have to talk next about the states that are doing well. How long can they actually hold on? Because the worse things get in some parts of the country, eventually it's going to bleed into the states that are taking this very seriously. So let's discuss that next. So this is a conversation where I want to see what you think. I'm not suggesting I know what needs to happen. I'm not suggesting any authoritarian tactics by states. I just want to see where you're at on this issue. Coronavirus is exploding at the national level. Some states are doing well, but when you look at the United States as a country in total, our worst 4 days in the United States in terms of new cases came in the last 5 days. So you go to the very beginning of the pandemic, the 4 worst days in terms of new cases have all happened in the last week. And yet here in Massachusetts, I'm so thrilled to say, we reported 0 deaths yesterday for the first time since the pandemic started. And in fact, New England and New York and New Jersey, this sort of 8-state consortium, these are some of the best places to be right now in terms of the degree of reduction in cases and transmission. Vermont had no new cases yesterday. New Hampshire had only 22. Maine had only 34. As I said, Massachusetts, 0 deaths and about 100 new cases. Connecticut, about 150. New York and New Jersey still with higher case numbers, but dramatic reductions. And again, relative to their population, the numbers are not quite so scary. So in terms of the consortium, our governor, Charlie Baker here, has expanded the no quarantine bubble to include New York, for example. Now you're going to be able to, if you travel from New York to Massachusetts, you're not going to be required to quarantine for 14 days, assuming you meet certain requirements. Masks are everywhere. As many of you know, I've been in Martha's Vineyard this week. Everybody's just wearing masks. You go everywhere, it's masks. You're not going anywhere and seeing people without them. But look at what's happening elsewhere. You've got these huge swaths of red states plus California which are seeing record cases. You've got California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, Ohio. And at some point, you're only going to keep that walled off for so long. At some point, if the cases keep exploding in certain parts of the country, the cases will start going up here in the Northeast. You have flights between these parts of the country. So-called mandatory quarantines are really tough to enforce, and people know it. People aren't doing it. So does the Northeast need to do something? Because we're hopefully looking at being able to safely reopen schools in the fall and do more. But if the cases start bleeding over from the more disastrous parts of the country, it's going to ruin the work we've been doing for months at this point. Again, reminder, I played this clip earlier, I'll play it again. Dr. Fauci is talking about 100,000 new cases a day in the US if things don't turn around. He says the infection rate is out of control in some parts of the country. Take a look at this clip one more time.
It is going to be very disturbing, I will guarantee you that, because when you have an outbreak in one part of the country, even though in other parts of the country they're doing well, they are vulnerable. I made that point very clearly last week at a press conference. We can't just focus on those areas that are having the surge. It puts the entire country at risk. We are now having 40+ thousand new cases a day. I would not be surprised if we go up to 100,000 a day if this does not turn around. And so I am very concerned.
So what should the Northeast do? I mean, legally, this is difficult. The Constitution grants ingress and egress to and from states, and I am not proposing that we violate the Constitution. Airlines have shown they are committed to having more flights and having flights be more full. So I don't know what, if anything, can be done. But if cases continue to explode to this degree in some parts of the country, eventually the pandemic's going to come back to the Northeast because people are traveling, people are ignoring quarantine. Can you do roadblocks, but not to stop people from coming in, merely to register that they are coming in and ask them, where will you be quarantining? You still can't really enforce it. You don't have the resources, but maybe if people go through that, they would be more mindful and maybe be more likely to stick to the required quarantine. I don't know. It's obviously beyond the resources of any state to really enforce it. So I have no idea. My question to you is, what should be done? We are beyond the early hotspot phase. The early hotspot phase was based on flights and the earlier spots of contagion, you had hotspots. It's now based on policy. The places with the better policy are doing better. The places with the looser policy are doing worse. What should be done? Should the Northeast do anything? Let me know what you think, and we'll have more coverage of this on our Instagram page, @DavidPakman Show. Make sure you're following us there.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It is great to welcome to the program today Phil Gurski, who's a 30-year Canadian intelligence veteran, author of 5 books on terrorism, and also host of the podcast An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. Phil, it's great to have you on today.
Hey, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
So, I mean, where to start, right? I guess the war on terror has now been waged for decades.
Yeah.
How is it going? Are we winning it yet?
No, we're not. And, you referenced the fact that I've written 5 books. My 4th book was actually entitled An End to the War on Terrorism. I hate the term. I've hated it since day one. As you noted in your introduction, I worked in security intelligence for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, kind of like an FBI, CIA hybrid. We looked at homegrown plots, Canadians traveling to join Al-Qaeda, later ISIS, etc., Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And yet we're framing this through the military. And the problem is, as an American academic said very wisely after 9/11, he says, whatever you do, don't declare war on a common noun, because it never ends. Think of the war on drugs in your country. Think on the war on poverty. Think on the war on any common noun. Because he said common nouns don't surrender, whereas proper nouns do. So you ask me, how's it going? It's going well and not so well. Well, in the sense that in your country and mine, we're not seeing terrorist attacks on a regular basis. Let's face it, that's true. And yet, if you look at the news on any given day, David, which I do as a regular course, even though I'm retired, I'm still involved in this business. Every day in Afghanistan, Somalia, or Nigeria, or Iraq, or Syria, there's an attack. And in several cases, many attacks per day in those countries. So it's going both well and not so well, depending on your perspective, I guess.
Here in the United States, there is an interesting report from the Anti-Defamation League, which I've referenced before, which looked at a politically based domestic terror killings, so to speak. And they are overwhelmingly right-wing. The numbers, as I recall, I think in 2019 were 76% right-wing, 20% Islamic extremism, and then 4% left or sort of miscellaneous. Now, from a logistical perspective, when I hear that someone believes their religion should be the law of the land and is willing to kill for those reasons, to me, that sounds right-wing. So when I think of Islamic extremism, it's often framed as left-wing. It sounds really right-wing to me. In the intelligence community, is there a position on that, on the characterization of Islamic violence?
Wow, I've never thought of it in that term before. We certainly looked at Islamist extremism as our number one threat. We had several plots in the 2000s and the 2010s. Several hundred Canadians went to join ISIS, et cetera, et cetera. We had a small right-wing desk, which frankly wasn't very busy when I retired in 2015. I'm sure it's busier right now. I would push back a little bit on the stats. It's true that in your country, obviously the far right is about 2/3 or 3/4 of the incidents.
Yeah.
Around the world, it's still 95% Islamist extremism, if you look at the numbers across the world.
No denial whatsoever.
Yeah. The way you framed it is really interesting. So I did write a book. My last book was entitled When Religions Kill. And I looked at how every religion has within it an extreme element that justifies killing in the name of God. Judaism, Christianity, even Buddhism. My God, Buddhist extremists should be an oxymoron. And yet there are Buddhist terrorists in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, and Myanmar. I guess you would say that Islamist extremists are conservative. They're definitely very intolerant. The view of Islam that they try to force on people is exclusionary. Essentially, it's my way or the highway. Bernard Lewis, the American academic, said very famously after 9/11, it's like I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell. That's the way these people see the world. So I guess from that perspective, we would look at it as right-wing. But from my experience working in the Canadian intelligence community, it was its own separate task. And it was the lion's share of the counterterrorism work for the better part of the 20 years you just referred to in the post-9/11 period.
When we think about the radicalization of individuals, when I've interviewed domestic extremists in the United States, like former KKK and white nationalists and others, almost exclusively, there's a story of there was a lack of empathy and support in their lives, which led them vulnerable to sort of join up with whoever paid them attention and accept the orthodoxy that they presented. In international terror and the work that you did, is it a similar pattern? What leads to the radicalization of an individual?
Wow, how much time do we have? I mean, my very first book, The Threat from Within, looked at it, and I was based it on cases I worked in Canada, unclassified information, obviously. But we found the opposite, David. We found that these people were run-of-the-mill average Canadians. They were average from a socioeconomic status. They were average from an educational background. They were average from a family background. They were average insofar as we could tell. We're not psychologists. From a mental health perspective, there was nothing that sort of divided them or separated them from the general Canadian populace. And I've seen the same stats for the United States as well. In terms of Islamist extremism, I do think that when you look at the far right, KKK, the Boogaloo Boys, you might see that kind of a bit of a tendency towards the down and out in life. You often hear the term marginalized. You hear the term not making ends meet, failing at education, failing at relationships, failing at work. You don't see that on the Islamist side, but of course you have exceptions. You look at a country like France, and a lot of the people who joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda in France are on the lower socioeconomic spectrum. But I would argue, you look at French Muslim society in general, and it's generally speaking, it's on the lower. Your country and my country are very different. Muslims in our country have tend to do very, very well. They tend to be highly educated. They tend to have good jobs, solid families, etc. In Europe, that's not the case for all kinds of historical reasons. Bottom line, David, is that there's no profile to any of this, and people that try to profile get into trouble because when you try to profile, you run into two problems.
Yes.
One's what I call a false positive. If you think that all jihadis or all right-wing guys are X, and somebody is X and is not a jihadi, that's a problem. And then if you say that no jihadis are well-educated or no KKK are well-educated, the first guy with a PhD you don't look at because he doesn't fit your profile. So when when I worked for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, we didn't have a profile. We looked at activity. We looked at online statements, which we had warrants to intercept. We looked at what they said and what they did, not who they were, where they came from, or what their particular circumstances were. And I think that was successful for us.
When it comes to the leaders of terrorist organizations, over the last 20 years, we've all seen endless headlines of the number 2 was killed, the number 3, whatever.
Yeah.
How important is that to actually fighting terror? And I'll make the question sort of a two-part question. Okay. One, if what we're fighting is an ideology, is the ideology affected by killing an individual? Is it sometimes yes, sometimes no? Okay. And then number 2, even from the operational standpoint, how effective is it to kill the number 1, the number 2, the number 3 guy?
I'm going to give you an answer you're not going to like. It depends.
Okay.
So in some groups, it's all about the leader. Like a group like Shining Path, the Sendero Luminoso in Peru. When Guzman was taken by the Peruvians back in the early 90s, the group never really recovered. They're still around, but they're a shadow of their former selves. You look at Al-Qaeda, bin Laden's gone. Now, Ayman al-Zawahiri can't hold a candle to bin Laden from a charismatic perspective. He's like watching paint dry. And yet Al-Qaeda's still around. We got Baghdadi, right, a couple of years ago. You guys got Baghdadi. ISIS is just as strong, if not stronger than it ever was. A better case is maybe the PKK in Turkey, the Kurdish militant group. The Turks captured Abdullah Öcalan back in 1994. He's been in prison on an island in Turkey for the better part of over 20 years. The PKK is carrying out attacks on a weekly basis in eastern Turkey. So the short answer is it depends on the nature of the group and the control of which the leader has within that group. The second part of your question is, look, it's never a bad thing to take out a major terrorist. We always used to say a dead terrorist is a good terrorist. You don't have to investigate him anymore. You don't have to worry about him. He can't exert his influence, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we can argue about rule of law and whether or not extraterritorial assassinations are legal. That's a whole other discussion. So taking guys out is never a bad thing. The problem is it rarely, if ever, means the end. And I'm tired of reading headlines. We've got so-and-so. This is the end of group number X, Y, or Z. It never is, or very rarely is, because, as you mentioned, it's the ideology that's important, not the individual. The individual can be charismatic, attract people, retain people, inspire people, but charismatic people are sometimes a dime a dozen. It's the ideology that matters. That's what you have to undermine, and that's a lot more difficult to carry. You can't carry a drone strike against an ideology, unfortunately.
I want to get back to that, but because you mentioned, the question as to the legality of extraterritorial killings of suspected terrorists, in the work you did that play at all in your work, or is that sort of like that was handled, the legal questions are handled somewhere else? Absolutely.
So we were essentially a domestic intelligence service, but we had an international remit because Canadians were fighting with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, things like that. We had lawyers, obviously, that were able to guide us, but we followed the law in the sense that we went to court to get warrants to intercept people's communications. You have to do that. You just can't, follow somebody on Twitter or intercept it because that's illegal in Canada. So from our perspective, we provided intelligence. And you provide it to decision makers. Now, sometimes the decision makers might be in the Canadian military or the U.S. military, and they will decide to do with that intelligence whatever their mandate says that they can do. I didn't lose sleep at night personally about my intelligence being used in a way that I might not necessarily agree with from my own ethical perspective, because first of all, Canada is a pretty small player, right? We're not carrying out drone strikes like you guys are in Yemen and Afghanistan and Somalia. So from that perspective, it wasn't as important. I do think there's a bigger conversation around this, and I know that when Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the American who was killed in Yemen a couple of years ago, that raised a real kerfuffle in your country because he was an American citizen and didn't get his day in court, right? He wasn't able to refute the charges against him. I didn't lose sleep over Awlaki because he was a major instigator. He was a major charismatic leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There wasn't a single Canadian that didn't follow his writings or his videos online. So him disappearing was a good news day for us. But on the other side of the coin, I do understand the legal ramifications of it. But when you work in intelligence, You provide the best information you can to those that can use it, and you do so to the best of your ability.
Okay, so now that being kind of framed in terms of your work, when we think about what does work to root out an ideology, I mean, is it one area that doesn't seem to be discussed enough is sort of the economic situation in the source countries. And when we talk about undocumented immigration here in the United States, you know, the current administration talks about walls and they talk about, you know, jail and all this stuff. If the economic circumstances were better in the source countries, the demand for trying to come to the United States illegally would decrease dramatically. Does that apply to thinking about the ideologies that rise and the way in which people can be indoctrinated? Can that be separated from the context in which these countries are existing?
You're asking really tough questions for me on Canada Day. That's a tough one. Again, it depends, because if you look at 9/11, for example, 15 of the 19 hijackers that attacked New York and Washington were rich Saudi individuals. They didn't have any socioeconomic problems. I do think that it obviously makes sense from a humanitarian and global stability perspective to make sure that every country is as economically feasible and workable as possible. And yes, it might in fact prevent or convince people to stay at home rather than come to Canada, United States. I mean, you know, we take in 1% of our population every year by immigration. We take in 300,000 people a year. So it's 1%. Your country has a similar high rate. I mean, it did under the current president, maybe not so much. So I think that, put it this way, David, it can't hurt, but I'm not necessarily certain that it would be enough to undermine the ideology. The ideology has to be undermined by the vast majority of people who live in that greater polity, be it Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism, whatever, who fight against it, who say this is not what we represent, this is not what our faith tells us to do, this is not what the founders of our religion said is a good thing to do. It's only those people that can say this is wrong, we're not going to support it, and we're going to actively undermine what you're trying to do. That to me, and I've seen it happen here in Canada on a limited scale, that to me is the only way we're going to say, you know, get rid of the Islamist extremist ideology or the Hindu extremist ideology in India, which is very worrisome, by the way, these days with what Modi is doing with his support from very violent Hindu extremists in the RSS and other parts of Indian society. Those are the people that have to stand up with our support and basically talk down and get rid of the ideology that is being spewed by a very small minority within their communities. Let's not exaggerate this, right? Very, very few people espouse this ideology.
Well, that's why when I hear you saying it has to be made clear by everybody else that this is not acceptable, it seems that that's already sort of the case, right? I mean, I guess what you're saying sounds so intuitive, and yet it starts to sound sort of like, you know, where are all of the moderate Muslims denouncing this? Yeah. And it's like, well, they are, right? I mean, it's so it starts to get into sort of dicey territory because you're already talking about such a small portion of any population.
Well, I would also counter that you're not going to get rid of this ideology. It's not going to disappear tomorrow. I mean, communism, which we fought against, I started my career in the Cold War in 1983. It was all Soviet Union, this, Soviet Union, that founded. And yet, look what's happening now in modern Russia. You could argue it's a resurgence of the communist ideal or whatever you want to call it. So the ideology is not going to, vanish, poof, one day into the ether. It's always going to be there. What you're trying to do is to make it such that it's an irritant, not an all-encompassing sort of this obsession you have. It's all terrorism all the time, but it's not all terrorism all the time. In my country, and I'm actually researching a book on the history of terrorism in Canada from Confederation, which is 153 years ago today. We've suffered at most 20 attacks in 153 years. Now, mind you, we went a century between attack 1 and attack 2, but you get my point, right? We're not Afghanistan. We're not Somalia. We're not Nigeria. We're not Yemen. Neither is your country. Neither are most countries in Western Europe. So how can we get away from this obsession about terrorism? Let our counterterrorism agencies do their jobs, as well as law enforcement, get citizenry involved to talk these guys down, to either ignore them or to counter their views. But let's not think that we're suddenly existentially threatened by terrorism. This is not an existential threat, David. It is if you're an Afghan. It's not if you're an American, and it's not if you're a Canadian.
We've been speaking with Phil Gurski, who's a 30-plus year Canadian intelligence veteran, author of 5 books on terrorism, also hosts the podcast An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. Phil, I so appreciate your time today.
My pleasure, David. Maybe we can do this again sometime.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Whether you're looking for David Pakman Show coffee for your Chemex or French press or a David Pakman Show t-shirt, it's all available on our website, shipping to anywhere in the world at davidpakman.com/gear. Don't miss the bumper stickers too. davidpakman.com/gear.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So all of the lies from the administration about the Russian bounty story have completely imploded and fallen apart. And the reason that they've fallen apart is that even if the lies were true, they would only expose new problems. So let me give you an example. If Trump really hadn't been briefed about the Russian bounty situation, that's the problem. Why wasn't he briefed? That would be an absolute and total disaster, given that we know the topic got to the National Security Council. If the Russian bounty situation was in his presidential daily briefing months ago, why doesn't he remember? Is it a memory problem? That's also a huge problem. In other words, the explanations we've heard so far, if true, would all just be indicative of additional new and even bigger problems. And to sort of reset the story, the news broke over the weekend that there were reportedly Russian bounties. These are like cash bonuses offered to Taliban-linked fighters. If they were able to kill U.S. or coalition troops in Afghanistan, they would get a cash bonus. Okay, that's absolutely and utterly insane. Initially, the White House was silent for, I believe it was 24 hours. Trump was not briefed about it. We were told multiple reports came out later that Trump had been briefed as early as 2019 to as recently as spring. And eventually we got to the specific claim that the bounty report was in his presidential daily briefing in February. So at a press briefing yesterday, Donald Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, was asked, why isn't Trump reading the PDB? In other words, if it was in there and Trump doesn't know about it, is he not reading it? Does he not remember? And Kayleigh goes bonkers, saying Trump is the most informed person on the planet on issues related to threats against the United States. Take a listen.
Ask you maybe to defend why the president isn't necessarily reading his PDB when there are these types of issues that could arise.
The president does read, and he also consumes intelligence verbally. This president, I'll tell you, is the most informed person on planet Earth when it comes to the threats that we face. You have Ambassador O'Brien, who sees him in person twice a day, who sometimes takes the upwards of half a dozen calls with this president. He's constantly being informed and briefed on intelligence matters. But I'm not going to allow the New York Times to dictate when we give top secret information and don't give top secret information. That's an untenable proposition.
Well, there then.
Yes.
The lie falls apart when you go too far. When Trump once said, I'm the least racist person in the world, it was too hyperbolic, right? Just say you're not racist. It would be not believable if you're Trump, but it would be more believable than I'm the least racist person in the world. Same thing here. Trump is the most informed person in the world on threats to America. He doesn't even read his own presidential daily briefings. Just say he's informed. Like, just be less hyperbolic and it would be less obviously unbelievable. And I think that the sort of key reminder here is let's not take our eye off the ball. The three key points about the Russian bounty story are, number one, they seem to have lied again. Trump was briefed or told about this in some way, shape, or form, multiple sources and allegations that he was told either in 2019 or February of this year or the spring of this year, or in all of those instances. That's number one. That's really important. They lied again. Number two, the lies they told, if true, are only indicative of other arguably just as big problems, like why wouldn't Trump have been briefed about it? Number three, Trump was briefed and he still wanted Russia back in the G7 to make it the G8. He still withheld arms from Ukraine that they would have used to defend themselves against Russian aggression. That's absolutely crazy. And I guess number four, I said it was three things, but there's four. Trump has certainly been briefed by now, right? We know now he's been briefed. So now the question is, what is he going to do about it now that he's been briefed and without a doubt knows about it? And the answer is nothing. Trump actually tweeted this morning. I don't have the tweet handy, but he essentially tweeted he doesn't believe the story. Like he's just dismissing the story, despite the fact that we have officials of all kinds saying it's a credible story, it's a real story, it's a story we should believe. So that's just as important. Trump now has been briefed. Doing something? No, he's not doing anything. He's just dismissing the story as completely fake. Those are the main 4 points that we should be thinking about, again, when we recognize the importance of removing this terror as we get closer and closer to November. From a strictly strategic perspective, Joe Biden should pick Elizabeth Warren as his vice president. I'm going to make the case for that now. Joe Biden already committed to choosing a woman to be his running mate. Joe Biden has been asked more and more lately to select a woman of color. We saw Senator Amy Klobuchar remove her name from consideration, saying Joe should really pick a woman of color. Now, I think part of it was Amy Klobuchar was wrapped up in the whole Derek Chauvin fiasco. We won't revisit that now, but I think that played a role. But in any case, Amy Klobuchar dropping out and saying Joe should really pick a woman of color rather than me. And that would be powerful in its own way. But from a merely strategic point of view, I believe Elizabeth Warren actually makes the most sense. If you balance name recognition, how progressive the candidates being considered are, and the effect that the choice would have on the electorate based on polling that we have, Elizabeth Warren seems like clearly the right selection to me. Now, there's a lot of talk about Kamala Harris, a black woman, current senator from California. Harris's identity would be very powerful. The first woman VP also being a black woman. There's no doubt that would be very powerful. The problem is Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record as Attorney General in the state of California. And that is not likely to pull in disaffected Bernie voters. It's not likely to appeal to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I don't believe that the disaffected Bernie voters are like this huge portion of the electorate, but this could be a very close race, particularly in some key states. And seeing a prosecutor of the failed war on drugs being Joe Biden's VP will do more damage, I believe, than the benefit of Kamala Harris's identity as a woman of color. You've then seen names thrown around like Stacey Abrams. Now, I like Stacey Abrams. She was a Georgia state rep. She ran for governor in Georgia in 2018. I don't believe she has the experience nor the name recognition to really help Joe Biden very much. I don't actually believe she's a top candidate right now. I think there's a very small chance that she is selected. Joe Biden's also reportedly considering Val Demings, a black congresswoman from Florida, and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. And there's an interesting case to be made for either of them. But it seems very clear to me that Elizabeth Warren, after Bernie, is the next most progressive candidate that was in the running in the Democratic primary in 2020. And she has the name recognition. And she has some important accomplishments to her name, including the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. When you talk about structural reform and you look at Kamala Harris versus Elizabeth Warren, Warren is much closer to being the structural change candidate than Harris. There's no doubt that Bernie was the structural change candidate, no question about it. But after Bernie, it's Warren, it's not Harris. And I think that that will have an appeal that the other candidates will not. Now, to make this point a different way, Warren would mobilize the group that Biden needs. Biden has 92% support from black voters. Biden is not as strong with the most progressive piece of the electorate. That's who Warren helps the most with. And I don't think she hurts him with black voters at all. And in fact, there's a Morning Consult poll that shows that Warren would bring in more black voters than even Harris would and even than Stacey Abrams would, which are very, very interesting and results that reinforce Warren being the strongest pick. So in short, to put it very simply, Warren is the most progressive, highly known person being considered. And in the polls, she helps Biden the most, not only with the most progressive voters, but also with black voters. So that's who I would go with. Now, that being said, there are all sorts of ancillary reasons to focus in on a woman of color instead of a white woman. I don't deny that for a second. There's also a case that Warren would be a strong cabinet pick for Biden if she weren't VP, and she could be very strong as Treasury Secretary, Secretary of Commerce, other possibilities. But vice president would be powerful and it would make an impact right away. Biden is reportedly going to make his choice around August 1st, so we will see who it is. One just other argument against Elizabeth Warren that I've seen, which is not a crazy one, is the argument that Warren is more valuable in the Senate. And that if she leaves, sometimes in Massachusetts, in these special elections, we elect Republicans to the Senate. We saw it with Scott Brown. This is not a seat we can afford to lose when we are looking to take control of the Senate in the fall. I don't know if it'll happen. It's an uphill battle. So that would be an argument against Elizabeth Warren. But it would be great to watch her destroy Mike Pence in those debates, wouldn't it? So my choice is Elizabeth Warren. I want to hear from you. Here's a voicemail that came in. Our voicemail number is 219-2-DAVID P. A voicemail about mask orders. Let's take a listen to it.
Hey, David. I wanted to see what your thoughts were with mandatory mask orders, just in general. A few cities have started enacting them, and I was curious if we should see that at the state level and what kind of punishments should be levied, assuming people violated them. Thanks.
Okay, so first let's talk about the legal basis. There is a legal basis for mask orders, no question about it. Remember that whole states' rights, power of the states thing that a lot of Republicans like to talk about? This falls under that. A federal nationwide mask order from the federal government would actually be legally dubious. State and local governments have pretty broad authority, particularly during a public health emergency. So I believe that the legal case for a statewide or citywide mask order is not legally problematic. Inside of businesses, remember, Republicans wanted this stuff. Businesses have broad authority within their businesses, and they can also say, you've got to wear a mask to be in my business. But I feel like it's the wrong focus. The reality is, I don't think this should come down to legality. It comes down to a legal question because so many people just don't want to wear a mask. We know they're very, very effective. What this should come down to is doing the right thing because we want to fix this and we want to take care of the people around us and we want to take care of our communities. So if you make this a legal argument, I believe that cities and states are very, very comfortably able to legally put in place mask orders. I hate that it's even a question. We should be doing it because it's just the right thing to do. We've got a great bonus show today. We will talk about what was a closer than expected race in the Kentucky Republican Senate. Amy McGrath officially winning against Charles Booker. We will talk about that. We will talk about the South Pole warming at 3 times the global average over the last 30 years. Horrifying stuff. And we will also discuss Mississippi dropping its Confederate-themed flag. All of those stories and more on the bonus show. Don't miss it. Become a member at joinpacman.com to get instant access.